Hello and welcome back to revise GCSE history.co.uk. This is the second video in the topic cattle ranching, and in this video today we're going to be looking at the open range and why the method of driving cattle on the long drive came to an end. So, problems for the cattlemen. Let's have a look. What problems did cattlemen encounter? Well, they had to drive their cattle to markets in the east. This was long and tough for cowboys. It was incredibly boring, and they called this journey the long drive. So from the name, you can tell, the long drive, that they had to drive their cattle on a very long distance, and this took a few months actually to drive cattle from markets from Texas to markets in the east. So that's called the long drive. Cattle drives brought cattlemen into conflict with the homesteaders who were beginning to settle on the Great Plains. As homesteaders settled, they blocked the routes of the cattle drives, and this angered cattlemen who could not drive their cattle. This picture up here shows a cattle drive across the Great Plains. Texas Longhorns, and if you remember back to last video, we said that Texas Longhorns were the traditional breed of cattle that were very hardy, and these Texas Longhorns carried a tick that caused Texas fever, and Texas fever was a deadly disease among cattle that killed them. It made them very, very sick, and it actually killed cattle. But because the Texas Longhorns were very hardy cows, they were immune to Texas fever. So Longhorns were immune to Texas fever. But the Texas Longhorns carried a tick that caused Texas fever, and although the Texas Longhorns were immune to this Texas fever, other cattle weren't, and this tick could kill other cattle, and homesteaders were afraid of this killing their cattle. So homesteaders might not have kept Texas Longhorns and kept other cattle, and the Texas fever tick could land on this other cattle and give it Texas fever and could kill a homesteader's cattle, and this angered many homesteaders, as you can imagine. So those were the problems with the long drive. Problems with the long drive. So what happened next? Let's have a look. Well, rather than driving cattle across the plains, why not settle cattle and set up ranches on the plains? If the homesteaders were moving and settling on the plains, why shouldn't the cattlemen? And this became known as the open range. So what cattlemen did is settle cattle on the plains and set up ranches there. So what was the open range? Well, unfenced land was used to graze cattle, and cattle were allowed to roam freely over this land. Cattle were branded to show which ranch they belonged to. So, I'm not sure if you know what branding is, but branding is where you put a stripe on a cow so you know, so you can identify it, so the cattleman knew which ranch the cattle belonged to. Land was not actually owned, as no rancher could afford to own all the land he required. To own all the land he required to graze his cattle, because such a vast amount of land was needed. So, as you can imagine, this may cause problems, because if land isn't owned, homesteaders might want to actually settle on the land and own it. So this is the open range, unfenced land where cattle was allowed to roam freely over it. Cattle were branded, but this land was not owned. So, why was the open range successful? Because for a while, the open range was actually successful, ranching cattle on the Great Plains. Well, the Plains Indians were defeated and confined to the reservations. This meant that the cowboys did rarely, if they ever did, they didn't come into contact with hostile Indians, because the Indians were defeated, living on the reservations under the power of the US Army. So native cowboys never, well, it'd be very rare if they did, had to fight off Native Americans. That's a total myth out of sort of Western films that they never came into contact with Plains Indians, really. There was not sort of a cowboys and Indians showdown like in Western films. And also the buffalo that had previously grazed on the Great Plains were gone. They had been slaughtered by the hunters, and don't worry about this for now. We'll come to look at this a bit more in a later video, in a later topic, but the buffalo weren't roaming the plains anymore. They'd all been slaughtered. And it was also discovered that if Texas longhorns were held on the northern plains during the winter, then the cold weather on the northern plains would kill the disease-carrying ticks, because if we remember, Texas longhorns carried a tick that caused Texas fever. Texas longhorns were immune to this disease, but other cattle could catch it from the Texas longhorns, such as the cattle of homesteaders. But if Texas longhorns were held on the cold northern plains during the winter weather, then the Texas fever tick would be killed. And also the transcontinental railroad that crossed the Great Plains were able to take cattle to market, so that made it practical too. However, the open range soon came to an end. It wasn't successful for very long. It was rather a short period of time where cattle were ranched on the plains, and it soon came to an end. So why exactly did the open range come to an end? Well, let's have a look. The terrible winters of 1886 and 1887, learn that date, it's so important, caused the deaths of thousands of cattle, and this greatly reduced the size of many herds. So Cattleman's herds were greatly reduced in numbers of cattle because of the cold weather in the winters of 1886 and 1887 that killed many cattle. This meant that cattlemen were unable to make as much money because lots of their cattle had been killed, and they'd also lost a lot of money when their cattle had been killed also, because obviously they've invested money in feeding and looking after their cattle, which are now dead and can't be sold as beef. As more cattle were ranched on the plains, I'll just change that mistake. The overcrowding of cattle resulted. This caused grass stocks for cattle on the plains to decrease, so grass stocks decreased. And as people ranched cattle on the open range, the cost of keeping cattle increased, which also led to a decreased profit. As the price of beef fell due to overstocking, cattle ranchers on the plains struggled to make profits. So we've got overcrowding, the price of beef falling due to more supply being available, and also the cost of keeping cattle is increasing, which is decreasing profits. So ranchers are struggling to make profits. So what finally happened because of all this is that large ranching corporations squeezed out smaller cattle ranchers. And also another factor I've just thought of while I'm talking through is a change in taste. And what I mean by that is the demand for Texas Longhorn beef decreased. So the popularity of Texas Longhorn was once high, but due to overstocking, with more and more of this beef available, people got a bit sick of it. The Texas Longhorn beef was typically quite gristly meat. It wasn't very high quality. People began to develop taste for more high quality beef that had a nicer taste, and also people began to eat stuff such as lamb rather than beef. So there's a change in taste, and that led also to a decreased popularity of beef. So there's less of a market for it because of that. Alright. So, we've actually covered all of the knowledge we need to learn for today's video. Here are 4 just quick questions based on all the stuff we've gone over. Pause the video here if you like, jotting down some answers to these questions, making sure you picked up the key points from today's video. If not, carry on watching and we'll simply go through these questions together. So question 1. Give one of the problems that cattlemen faced on the cattle drives. Well, they often coming into conflict with homesteaders was one of the problems they faced. There are also many more. Check back to the earlier slide in the video that lists all of these problems to check your answers are valid. Question 2. Briefly describe what the open range was. So that was when cattlemen started to ranch cattle. So it's the ranching of cattle on the plains. They were allowed to roam freely. The land wasn't owned, land not owned, and cattle were also branded to show what ranch they belonged to. So there's just a few key points about that. Question 3. Give a reason why the open range was successful to start with. One reason I can think of was the Indians, the Native Americans, were defeated and confined to the reservations, so they were no longer roaming across the plains and were under control of the US Army. There are also other reasons you could have had for question 3. Check back to the earlier slide to see if your answer was correct. And finally, question 4, let's have a look at this one. Why did the harsh winters of 1886 and 1887 mean that the open range came to an end? Well, the harsh weather killed cattle, and then that reduced the size of herds. There we are. Okay, so these are the answers to the 4 quick knowledge record questions for today's video. If you have found this video useful, visit my website, GCSEhistory.uk, where you can view more revision videos and also videos on exam technique in the members zone, similar to this one today. Thank you for watching, good luck with your studies, and I hope to see you guys again very, very soon. Thanks.